We're here, well, I'm not, I'm here to chair, but the team here are here to discuss the statement. I think we're going to make it less abrasive than debate. The statement that a second referendum is unnecessary. Debate, discuss, and hopefully illuminate. Supporting that sentiment, we've got Toby Young, author, journalist, free schools advocate, and currently associate editor of The Spectator. Don't worry, Toby, I don't know anything that you don't. I mean associate editor of The Spectator, not currently. Diane James, possibly, and I haven't fact-checked this because that's very unfashionable these days, but possibly the shortest-lived leader of any political party, when she briefly, no, we don't do booing, certainly not before we started discussing, any political party, when she briefly became leader-elect of UKIP. She now stands as an independent MEP, which does suggest some kind of masochistic tendency, surely. And opposing them, if you will, the philosopher A.C. Grayling, or Anthony, as I'll refer to him today. Maybe you were right. You're displaying terrible favoritism before we've even begun. Founder of the New College of the Humanities and a passionate advocate for the principle of European integration. And finally, Joe Maugham, founder of the Good Law Project, and author of the waitingfortax.com blog, whose pioneering efforts to use the law to argue against various Brexit complexities, including whether Article 50 can be revoked, have put him at the forefront of the Remain movement. So let's start off with you, Toby, because you've fired a shot off the bows in this debate already in a Spectator column where you feared being torn limb from limb by today's audience, which I laughed at when I read it. But actually, listening to you today, I'm not so sure blood won't be spilled. Anyway, let's test them, shall we? Can you elaborate on why you think a second referendum is the last refuge of inept opposition?
Well, we can get onto that in a minute. I wanted to begin by doing a bit of growth clearance and try and define what it is we're talking about. Now, as I understand it, the proposition is that once a deal is on the table, there should be a second referendum, and the choice should be between leaving the EU and embracing that deal, so leaving the EU on those terms, or reverting to the pre-Brexit status quo, so the relationship we had with the European Union before the vote last year. I think if that is what we're discussing, if that is the proposition on the table, there are two assumptions being made there that I think the other side has an obligation to justify. The first is that if we did decide to reject the deal, if there was a second referendum and that was the result, it's an assumption, isn't it, that the Article 50 process is reversible. As I understand it, I think the conventional wisdom is that once Article 50 has been triggered, it isn't reversible. Now, I hope Jolyon will speak to that, and I'm sure he will. The other assumption, which I think is more difficult for the other side, is the assumption that there will be something on the table in 22 months' time, or something like that, which will enable us to see what our future relationship with the European Union would be like outside it. And that assumes that the Article 50 deal and some sort of free trade agreement are going to be in place, negotiated and in place in 22 months' time. That seems to me to be incredibly unlikely, not least because the EU have said they want to negotiate those two deals consecutively rather than simultaneously. In all likelihood, in 22 months' time, all we'll have on the table is the Article 50 deal, and we won't know what our trading relationship with the European Union will look like. That'll take some time longer to negotiate. There'll probably be a transition arrangement in place. There'll be five to 10 years, I think.
You might want to use some of your 3 minutes to answer to the actual motion, which is a second referendum. Why a second referendum is unnecessary.
I'm trying to understand what a second referendum is. And what
that's
it is
what we can talk about afterwards, but you're actually here. We can talk about the intricacies of it afterwards. If you feel a second referendum is unnecessary.
I think a second referendum after the Article 50 deal has been tentatively agreed, but before we know what the free trade arrangement is going to look like, would be a bit pointless. But I think if you're proposing that there should be a second referendum at some point in the future, once we've left the European Union, then I think that's a reasonable proposition.
Okay. Well, I'm quite curious as to why we'd need a second referendum after we've left the European Union. But we had a second. But we can come back to that.
We had a second referendum last year, The first referendum was in 1975. We decided to join.
Some people weren't even born then.
But then there was a second one last year in which we decided to leave. Now, there could be a third one in which we decide to rejoin, and it might be that AC, Grayling and others want to campaign for that, but it might be 40 years, 41 years until that referendum takes place.
We'll come back to that, thank you. Diane, Brexit, you've long fought for it, but is it shaping up as the Brexit you wanted? I mean, I'm not even sure if you know what this Brexit is going to look like, since none of the rest of us do. And is it the Brexit that the nation voted for, or is there room for a second consultation, as it were, a second round on the final deal?
Okay, I'm a proponent of clean Brexit, which of course the EU has tried to instead introduce the language of a hard or a soft Brexit. Now, I want a clean Brexit on the basis that I don't want generations to come, or even generations now, to be picking up the tab, the responsibilities, the liabilities for a failed concept. Now, had that concept devised 60 years ago been capable of change, we may not have even had to have had a referendum in the UK on the basis of do we stay in or do we come out. The fact that that concept was unable to make any movement towards addressing the challenges outside of the European continent has led us to where we are. In terms of a second referendum, we're just about to get, if you want to be somewhat cynical, the opportunity for a second referendum. It's via the general election. It's as simple as that. You've got this polarisation of parties. No, you have. Look, come on. The Liberal Democrats have made it abundantly clear that they are going to be campaigning to stay in and to reverse, and the Tory party are coming at it from a different angle. I think what is disturbing is the degree of political opportunism that is going on, particularly from the European Union, which has decided which has decided to put into the negotiating stance all these sort of issues that they feel will aggravate people like yourselves. You know, a hard or a soft border between ERA and Northern Ireland. Suddenly giving Spain veto over a Gibraltar deal.
Calling an election that you said was never going to happen, that's not political opportunism.
Sorry?
Calling an election that you said was never going to happen.
Ask the Tory party that. I'm not a Tory member. So.
Just one.
But, well, I think, but your question I've actually answered. I've said, you know, in my terms, the general election is a second referendum dressed up as something slightly
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we don't really need catcalling, because that's sort of unnecessary when we're here to discuss a subject that we haven't even heard from two of the people on the panel. Thank you. Anthony, you have said that referendums are extremely bad ideas in a representative democracy, that they remove important decisions from proper deliberation and examination which they need, which would slightly seem to put you in Toby and Diane's camp.
Not at all. I think that certainly, but I also think that they have the very best plan B around, especially given that the referendum last year, you may remember here in a general election setting, the parties present us with a manifesto, with promises, with costings, with ideas about what they want to do and what would happen if they did them. But in the referendum last year, the Leave campaign gave no details, no plan, no roadmap, no idea of what would happen, no costings, no nothing. Just a whole lot of lies and false promises and deceptions. And so, of course, there has to be another referendum. Of course, we must have a look and see what, at very least, the outlines of a deal might look like, so that we can decide whether or not we want that or we want to stay. That's called democracy. And the Leave campaign after the referendum, when 37% of a restricted franchise voted to leave, which is about a quarter of the population, but that quarter of the population is the people. So if they're keen on the people having a vote and having a say in major decisions of this kind, then a second referendum is absolutely necessary.
Thank you. And Joe, is there a legal precedent? Quite a simple question, or not, perhaps. Is there a legal precedent for a second referendum? I mean, the European Union Act, I think, of 2011, doesn't seem to have provision for it, but like so much else about a departure, it's kind of unclear, isn't it?
Well, it's absolutely not unclear. It is absolutely clear that if the remaining 27 member states agree that we should remain, we can remain. I mean, that's the publicly stated view of the Commission, it's the publicly stated view of the Parliament, and it's the publicly stated view of the Commission. And on any view as a matter of law, it is right. A treaty can be made or remade by the signatories to the treaty. So if they agree, there is absolutely no doubt that we can withdraw the notification. The only area of doubt is whether we have control over our future. So do we have the right to say, we want to remain and so we shall remain, or must we ask the other 27 for permission to determine our future? And fundamentally, that's the question of unilateral revocability. If we can unilaterally revoke, we hold in our own hands the power to determine the nature of our future relationship with the EU. And if we don't hold that power in our own hands, because we can't unilaterally revoke, then we must seek their permission. And for me, and I think for anybody who wants power to rest in the hands of the people of the United Kingdom, it must be desirable that we do not need the consent of the other 27.
But you're talking to Article 50 there, aren't you, and the
Yes.
possibility of that being revoked. What about a second referendum? Is there anything in law that indicates that there needs to be a second referendum before a final deal is done?
I mean, there is an argument floating around, based on the 2011 Act, as you rightly indicate, that suggests that there might be an existing and extant legal need for a second referendum. I mean, it's an interesting question for academic pointy heads, but rather like this question about our future in the European Economic Area, it's a question of no political consequence. It's a question of no political consequence because all of these questions in relation to which there's any doubt at all are all going to be swept up in what we're styling the Great Repeal Bill, which of course doesn't repeal and isn't, certainly if you're sitting in this hall, great. But all of these questions are going to be swept up in that bill, so it's pointless agonizing as academics or as lawyers over what the legal answers are, because political answers will be provided in the Great Repeal Act.
Thank you all. You set up your stalls very nicely for us, I think. So let's start by talking about a second referendum. Is this election a second referendum in your eyes? And is there any point in even discussing one until we get to the point where we know what a deal would look like?
From the point of view of the EU, it makes absolutely no difference whatever, whether or not Theresa May has a majority of 12 or a majority of 120. Makes no difference whatever. From that point of view, this general election is an irrelevance. It does matter that there should be as many votes cast as possible for anti-Brexit candidates and parties, so that we can see what the percentage is out there in the electorate, what its sentiment is. But the motivations that Mrs. May has had for calling this election now have very, very little to do indeed with the Brexit process, other than an admission that the referendum last year wasn't a full mandate. She claims that she wants another one. There are some people who think that she wants an increased majority so she can handle the headbangers on the right of the Conservative Party in Parliament. That may not help her very much if she has any hope of trying to achieve a soft Brexit type of deal, because they will be very angry about that. She may have called the election in order to preempt losing a majority in Parliament because so many of her MPs are under investigation for electoral fraud. I mean, there are all sorts of different motivations that she might have had, but the main one is, of course, that this is the only election she could possibly win, because had she waited until 2020, by that time, the tsunami of difficulties and complexities and bad news about what would happen to this country if Brexit does happen would be so overwhelming that she would have no chance of winning an election.
John Major, the Conservative, has talked about the tyranny of the majority and how the voice of the 48% who voted against Brexit will now be quashed entirely. Do you think that that's what this election was set up to do, to silence emphatically dissent so that we could power ahead for this hard Brexit, which none of us are quite sure actually the meaning of?
Well,
including the government, one might suggest.
no, I don't think so. And I think the fact that the government will be led by someone who was a former Remainer and who initially embraced the Remain cause does mean that the views of the 48% are not going to be ignored.
But she's liable to change her mind quite often, isn't she?
I was surprised. I was surprised when Diana was booed for suggesting that the election is a second referendum, because that's a direct quote from Gina Miller. It was Gina Miller who said that we should treat this election like a second referendum, treat it as an opportunity to reverse the decision. So she was just quoting Gina Miller. I think that it does point, though, to a larger problem that the people on Anthony and Jolien's side have, which is it looks almost certain that our next Prime Minister will be Theresa May. Given the opportunity to vote for anti-Brexit candidates in this forthcoming election, very few people will do so. I think it's possible that Lib Dems will end up with even fewer seats than they have already. But that points to a larger problem, which is if you try and agitate for a referendum by fair means or foul in 22 months' time, before we've actually formally left the European Union, the likelihood is all we'll have on the table is a fairly good Article 50 deal. We won't know what the free trade arrangement looks like at that point, and in all likelihood, all the opinion polls tell us that that referendum would be won again by our side, and it would then be very difficult for you, I think, to agitate for another referendum. Look at the problems that Nicola Sturgeon has in agitating for another independence referendum in Scotland so soon on the heels of the referendum they've just lost. I think tactically it would surely be much more sensible to wait until we've left, wait until a free trade agreement is in place, and if you want to then have a referendum about the terms of that deal, and if you reject it to then petition to rejoin, then fair enough. But surely if you think that things are going to go completely pear-shaped and it's going to be an economic catastrophe for the UK to leave the EU, wait 10, 15 years when things have really gone pear-shaped and then have a rejoin referendum. And then you might, if that's what you think is going to happen, that would be the sensible thing to do.
Anthony and Joe, I mean, is there a point there in what Toby's saying, in that all this talk about a second referendum in a way sort of clutches the horizon, that ultimately if there was a second referendum, if Theresa May called one for June the 8th to coincide neatly with the election, the result would be the same?
Look, I'm a Democrat. I don't think that if in March of 2019 people are still happy with the way in which the country is heading out of the EU, we should have a second referendum. I mean, that's bananas. But if the people want another referendum, if they've taken another look at the evidence of what Brexit means for the future of the country, and they form the view, and we'll see it in the opinion polls, and we'll see it in MPs' postbags, and we'll see it in the editorials of our leading newspapers. If people have taken another look at what Brexit means and they hate it, to drag the country out of the EU in those circumstances isn't democracy, it's dictatorship. We should listen to what the people want. What are Toby and Diane afraid of?
Anthony.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, politics is all about sentiment. It's all about what people feel and want and what the mood of the country will be. And if, as the news, mainly bad news about what Brexit means, continues to pile up, so we've seen already the latest YouGov poll shows a shift in that sentiment. And if in 18 months or 2 years' time there are repeated and persistent opinion polling data saying 60, 70% of the people are very, very worried about leaving the EU and don't want to leave, well, in that circumstance, the very pusillanimity and feebleness of our MPs will be on our side, because they will be so frightened about losing their seats at the next election that they may have a change of heart. We may not need a second referendum, because they may just say, let's stop this madness right now.
Well, there could be a vote of no confidence, I presume. I mean, that's the other access, I suppose, in a democracy. But Diane, are you eager for a Brexit no matter how it impacts on our future, no matter what the cost? Because at the moment, none of us really know what that future looks like. I mean, that's a fair thing to say. But at the moment, we are 12% down. The pound is 12% down on the euro, 20% down on the dollar since the referendum. How bad does it have to get before you think, ooh, maybe it wasn't such a brilliant idea after all?
Okay, let's just correct one of the key comments you've just made. Where was the sterling against the dollar back in 2008? It was up at 1.4 or above that. I think it was actually somewhere between 1.4 and $2 to the pound. There has been changes in terms of the financial circumstances across the world and sterling's value against the dollar. It's not
Okay,
just
let's not waste time on that because
no,
it is commonly believed and directly attributable
but you,
to our decision to
coming
leave the EU.
across,
But anyway.
in terms of the question as, and I've just heard it repeated in the last few minutes, this continuation of Project Fear. Let's start looking at some positive news.
What is the positive news?
Positive
I'd
news.
love to hear
Look
some.
at our unemployment rate, which is so pitifully small, and I mean that in a positive way.
And that's with all those immigrants coming in.
What would you rather have? Would you rather have, and would people here rather have 48% youth unemployment as Italy, Spain, some of the other southern Mediterranean countries have got, compared to our unemployment rate that we've got now? Would you rather see,
whilst in the
would you rather see scenarios where we are really motoring in terms of entrepreneurs, innovators setting up their own businesses within a system in Europe that just doesn't facilitate that? So I actually see very positive news, and I looked only to this week as a very good example. Mr. Draghi went to the Netherlands to talk about the state of the ECB and European financial policy, and he got an absolute drubbing from the Netherlands Parliament, and rightly so, because he was called to account. How do you defend a fiscal policy which, quite frankly, the words we use, is going down the drain? Why will you not see sense, and why will you not change, do some degree of U-turn, and come up with issues and aspects that actually address the challenges across Europe, member states, the other 27?
Joe, I wonder if you could reply to Diane, but also bearing or taking into account the fact that there does seem to be a need for Europe to do some legwork as well here. I mean, since the referendum, since people's dissatisfaction, the dissatisfaction of British voters with the state of the current relationship with the EU was made emphatically clear last summer, there's been very little conciliation on their part, very little acceptance of the fact that perhaps there is something slightly broken about the model.
I'm not sure I'd quite agree with it put in that way. Certainly, many discussions now across the Channel are dominated by Brexit, as are many discussions here. And that's a tragedy for Europe, as it is a tragedy for us, because let's face it, the problems that we have, and indeed the problems that Europe has, and the problems that the whole of the Western world have, are very big problems indeed. And if you're me, you look at Brexit as being a step change in the wrong direction to solving those problems. But even if you think Brexit is a step in the right direction, it doesn't make those problems go away. So it's a huge distraction, and it's a distraction on the continent as well. I think it's wrong to say that there is no recognition on the continent of the weaknesses in the European project. But, you know, let's be realistic about this. There is no institution in the world that is inamenable of criticism. What you're really trying to do is compare various degrees of inadequacy with all institutions, and a good thing too. If you stop doing that, you become complacent and you find yourself in the situation that we have as a nation, where there is enormous distrust in the establishment. Our establishment became complacent about the extent to which the establishment was meeting the needs of people outside London, and has received a great big bloody kick in the teeth for it. And you know, let's hope, if nothing else, that what emerges from Brexit
Julian,
is some understanding of that state of affairs.
Just on that point, the people who voted to leave were, on the whole, people, as you say, not exclusively, but largely people who felt disenfranchised, who were hostile to the political class.
Yeah.
Don't you think that that would be compounded, that sense of alienation would be compounded if the government suddenly said, we're going to ignore your vote, which we presented to you as a definitive choice between leaving or remaining, we're going to ignore that and hold a second one? Don't you think that would drive them completely potty?
Can I put, well, Joe, if you would answer briefly, and then I'd like to put it to Anthony.
I mean, one problem we have here is that our press, our media, simply don't give us enough insight into the debate within the EU and its institutions about the EU. Because if you do look into that, and I've just come back from a couple of days in Brussels talking with very impressive Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, they are perfectly conscious of the fact that there are many problems and flaws. This is a great imaginative project involving 28 nations. I mean, no country, as Jolyon correctly says, look at the United States of America, has got any number of internal problems. So any great project like this is going to have problems and difficulties. The fact that it's not perfect doesn't mean you run away from it. What they're trying to do is they're trying to think their way through how you manage something as imaginative and as noble as this, because you think about the progress, the unity, the peace that the EU has brought, all the promise that it gives to our young people. You see it.
But how do you go about translating that to the man and woman on the street who don't feel any of that? Because that's where the great failure has been, isn't it?
Well, you stop this relentless tabloid attack and deception and misinformation about the EU and what it involves. That is a necessity.
Joe, you asked Joe.
For myself, I think it's a cul-de-sac for the left and indeed for the centre to blame the media. You know, we have the media we have to learn to live with it. If we don't like it, then you know, whining about it isn't going to change the situation. I do want to answer Toby's point. It's a good and it's a fair and it's a proper question. And the point that Toby puts is, well, what happens to those people who feel unheard by the establishment if we have a second referendum? And I put, in response to that, another question back to Toby. What happens if the people who voted for Brexit because they believed that it would be better for the NHS, who believed that it would leave them wealthier, who believed that it would lead to materially less immigration, who believed that it would lead to greater prosperity for them, are not heard? What if those things that they were promised do not happen? How do they then feel about the functioning of their establishment? And having put that question, I'll answer it as well.
Or we could defy convention and let Toby.
Briefly. Which is to say this: we must continue to listen to the people. We must continue to listen to what they want. And if the evidence of what Brexit means does not turn out to be what they believed it would be, and they do not any longer wish to leave the EU, we cannot drag them out against their will.
Maybe I could just add a question to it.
Okay.
I could just add a question to that, which is, wasn't the referendum a cop-out in the first place, really? Because it was in order to silence a very vocal part of the Conservative Party. I don't think the Prime Minister at the time ever thought that it would go through. And how many times can you go to the people? Isn't the whole point of our democratic system that we vote in a government that we believe are true to their manifestos and will go through with whatever they've promised?
Well, I think, just to respond to Jolyon's point, I don't think that the things that you've said are likely to happen, are going to happen. Obviously, Diana and I think that the outcome of Britain becoming independent again won't be catastrophic.
You might be wrong.
We might be right, we might be wrong, but I think even if we are wrong,
but this is the problem for most people, that
it
nobody...
would be taken as a betrayal in the same way that ignoring people's
What about if
voice in the first
those
referendum
millions don't go into the health service?
On the second...
300 and exactly how many was it?
That wasn't going to happen immediately, only after we've left, and we haven't left yet, so let's see what happens. But your second question, what was it again? I had an answer to that.
Oh, excellent. That's always good news. The point of the referendum being a bit of a cop-out in the first place,
well,
and this idea of constantly going back to the people when, you know, as you say, we have an election coming up.
Yeah, well, I think given the way people voted in the referendum, I think the referendum was necessary because it became clear that people hadn't consented to being as fully integrated within the EU as we are. People hadn't consented to freedom of movement, for instance. If the result had been an overwhelming majority wanting to stay in, then yes, it would have been pointless. But actually, it discovered this democratic deficit. It discovered that there wasn't popular consent for what was happening. So I think, therefore, the referendum was necessary to redress that.
Diane, I've forgotten what I was going to say, so you can answer to Toby's point. Yes, I have completely forgotten.
Would you want a minute to ask?
No, you can. You've had to listen to quite a lot, so I think.
Let me just respond to a couple of comments, if you don't mind, that I've heard. The degree of information about how the EU operates, I don't think is any different in the European member states than it is here in the UK. The quality of the reporting depends on how the member state is in terms of how long their membership. So, for instance, if I go to the Balkan states, if I go to some of the former Soviet Union states, they tend to be very, very pro the European Union concept, and therefore their media and their press coverage tends to be very nuanced in that area. I happen to think that our coverage here in the United Kingdom is very, very balanced indeed.
It is.
I would like to pick up on one of the other points that was made. In terms of the two principal organisations that fought to leave in terms of their campaign, both of them had pan-party representation. Now, if we go back to 2015, yes, there was only one political party that promised a referendum on membership of the European Union in their manifesto. But the fact that people like Gisela Stewart, for whom I've got immense respect, she was a very powerful presenter and a very powerful speaker. I didn't happen to be part of the Vote Leave campaign. I was on the Leave.eu side. But every time she came on radio and on TV as a German-born citizen, but now a UK MP and pro-leaving the European Union, her arguments and the way she put those across were very, very compelling indeed. And she wasn't unique in terms of that. I think the last point I would make, and I've made this point in the Parliament chamber, and I think it's a view shared by all of the UK contingent and certainly by the Eurosceptic wing within the Parliament, is this issue of the degree of decision-making taken by the European Union effectively in secret. You know, there's reference made to trialogue, there's reference made to decisions made by Council of Ministers, by commissioners, which never actually gets to be aired, you know, even for the British press to be able to pick it up. And for instance, as an MEP, all too frequently, I am presented with material on which I have to vote, and I've got no means to send it back. I can't refuse it, I can't decline it. The best I can do is...
But you could vote on it.
The best I could ask is for the rapporteur to go back to the Commission and say, the Parliament would like you to think again. But that doesn't stop it. It doesn't reverse it. All it does is just buys, if you like, delay time, and ultimately it still comes through. Now, if you take some of those factors into play, that is why there is this degree of EU skepticism across Europe. And it's not something we can walk away from. Now, you know, I know people are really, really pleased at the fact that Macron won.
Sorry if I could interrupt, because we're sort of running out of time.
But, you know, the point is that's not going away, this disillusionment with a concept that has shown itself unable, unwilling.
But are you open to the EU coming back to Britain with a gorgeous offer that would be absolute fools to refuse? At that point, would you say, okay, you know what, we should ask the people again, because this is a whole different scenario?
Well, the chances of that happen are absolutely nil. Well, pigs would have to fly.
They had an opportunity to do that.
And that was shown and demonstrated when David Cameron went to the European Union and came back with absolute, you know, quite frankly, nonsensical stuff to present to the UK population. What has been shown by the hardline stance and by Verhofstadt, I've got no time for Verhofstadt, I'm unlike yourself, Jolan, but the point is the hardline stance that they're taking over there, actually all it's doing is helping Euroscepticism increase in terms of support. It's not building Europhile support at all.
Thank you very much. We would like to hear what the people are thinking. So could we possibly have some questions? But we want no questions. If you just hear me out, we want no questions from people who've already asked questions this morning. So if you've already asked questions this morning, please sit down and wait for the next session or the one after that. And if you're under 30 and you voted for Brexit, we particularly want to hear from you, and you can go to the front of the queue. Now, I don't think we're going to get through all of them, I'm afraid. I think we probably have time for about 3 people on each side. But if anyone sees someone who's already asked a question this morning, then please let me know, because that's absolutely emphatic. Okay, so let's start with this gentleman over here, please.
Hello. My question is for Professor Grayling in particular, but if anybody else wants to address it, by all means. Referendums and rule by plebiscite have often been used and abused by people to run countries the way they want to be run. And the previous one, I believe, was used very much to that effect. And if we're going to have a second referendum, how are we going to stop that one from being used and abused by the people who want to go their way, to misinform people and to lie about certain things? How are we going to stop that happening? Because I believe that there's too much distrust in the establishment and MPs can't do their job, those that want to do their job, as representing us. Therefore, I think the second referendum is very likely. So I've accepted that to a degree, but how are we going to stop it being used and abused?
And is your question for someone in specific?
Professor Grayling
Professor
in
Grayling.
particular, but if anybody else wants to touch on
it's just we're so short of time, we're going to have to be brutal. Sorry.
Well, as Mariella pointed out, in general, I'm against the idea of using referendums in a representative democracy for complex reasons to do with what a representative democracy is. But if you are going to use them, then they have to be very, very carefully designed. Not like this sloppy, faultless, inattentive referendum that we had last year, in which there was no supermajority bar, the franchise was restricted, not letting people vote who had a very, very serious material interest in the outcome, excluding them deliberately, by the way, because we've heard from David Cameron since then that he didn't want to arm wrestle with the Tory right by getting 16 and 17-year-olds into the franchise.
Anthony,
so if you're going to have a
change
referendum,
that for the future? I think that's and we need to be.
Yes, the way you change it in future is that you really design the referendum extremely carefully so that it is a genuine reflection of feeling in the country and not something like this one, advisory only, 37% only of the electorate voted for it, which is less, by the way, than the bar on the Scottish devolution referendum back in 1979, which had a majority, 51.6, but it was stopped because of the bar.
Okay,
You've got to design it properly if you're going to do it at all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This gentleman here.
Thank you. I'll just do this quickly. This is for Toby Young and Diane James. This election clearly isn't a second referendum because there isn't an opposition. And we risk an increasingly divided nation. Surely an informed referendum would be the only way to heal those divisions.
Can I just ask, have you asked a question already today?
No.
No, okay. Sorry.
I'll answer your point in a second, or perhaps
No, we
Diane
should
will.
answer that point.
I just want to come back on something.
Otherwise, I'm going to
Professor
run out
Grayling
of
just
time,
said.
and we're going to be.
He made the point that less than 50% of those eligible to vote voted to leave, but less than 50% of those eligible to vote voted for Macron in the French presidential election. Only 43.63% of those eligible to vote actually voted for Macron. Would you rerun the French presidential election on the same grounds?
Okay, thank you. Can we answer this gentleman and then we'll move on to, because I want to get two more people in at least.
I only wish that this forthcoming general election wasn't a second referendum, but it's the political parties at the moment that have turned that into that scenario, and also this increase in terms of political movements. Some of them supported by high-profile individuals, and they are turning this general election into a second referendum. Can I just say, though, that if the head of the Greens party in the European Union, Mrs. Harms, gets her way, she announced last autumn that national referenda should be banned across European Union member states because they were too dangerous to the European Union concept. So if she gets her way, actually, the United Kingdom won't be allowed to have a referendum on precisely this sort of subject. Now, if that's not denial of democracy, then there is an issue.
Thank you very much. This lady here.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, I do politics at A-level, and I was just wondering, we talk about referendums a lot and how complicated they are, and I'd like to add a disclaimer. I don't think the electorate is stupid, but can you trust that in a referendum with 4 or 5 different options, with lots of technical language and technical little bits of legislation, that everyone in the electorate will know exactly what they're voting for? How can you ensure that?
Thank you. Joe.
I mean, this is a genuine difficulty that I have with the referendum that we had last year. What was the majority for? Because there were so many different and conflicting accounts of what the world outside the EU would look like? Would we be inside the single market, or was it, as Dan Hanan said, no question of us leaving the single market? Would immigration be reduced, or would it just be controlled? Would we be better off, or is poorer a price worth paying to be beyond the clutches of Brussels? Now, if you ask yourself the question, was there more than 40% of the population that supported any single one of those alternative and sometimes conflicting views of the world outside the EU, then the answer invariably is no. And the only way in which you can remedy that difficulty is by comparing two known worlds. The known world that we have at the moment, where we are still a member of the European Union, and the known world of the final deal that Theresa May manages to conclude with the remaining 27. Then you can have a proper, fair comparison, and you can ask the question, which of those worlds, the extant world or the future world, has the real majority?
Thank you. And I'm afraid this lady here is going to be our final question of the session. Sorry? I can't hear you.
She voted for Brexit and she's 18, I think.
Yeah. You don't have to tell me what age you are. You can just come and ask a question. Welcome.
When you say we should listen to the people, why are commentators or decision makers so scared to hear from young people? So I'm a young person myself, and my opinion doesn't matter. And I was just wondering why.
It does.
It does, of course.
It does matter, but you're probably too young to vote, aren't you?
Too young.
Yeah, but what would you like to see? Is there something that we can put to the? I mean, do you feel that young people? I mean, I'm sure everyone will agree that young people's voices do matter. Why do you feel that yours doesn't?
Maybe because I feel like that it isn't heard as much from where I'm standing. Maybe because I don't have the opportunities to speak out, but I'm here now, so.
Did your classmates care about Brexit one way or the other?
Yeah, they did.
What did they think?
They felt like we should remain, mainly because if we did have to go through the process where we had to leave, and sooner or later people would realise that would end up being the wrong decision, and people would want to come back, and they would want to be a part of the EU again.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Mariella, can I say?
Sorry.
Can I say I emphatically believe that the voting age should be lowered to 16. 16 and 17-year-olds should have the vote. I also think that voting should be compulsory. It's a civic duty, and the referendum last year has proved that it should be.
I'm going to take two last questions from these two women here, because otherwise I think they will actually lynch me. Toby, you were right. So if we could go with this lady first, and then you, and then we'll answer them both, and I'm afraid that's got to be the end.
Okay. So I think...
I said this morning. Thank you there.
I think most Remainers online have probably been trolled by Leavers telling them that Brexit means Brexit and they should just suck up the vote and accept the will of the people.
Yeah.
But I have been contacted by Remainers who have also said that as a Democrat they feel like they have to accept the outcome of the referendum, and that therefore means that their opinions and their lifelong beliefs are no longer valid, and many of them are now shifting over to the Tory party because of their strong and stable leadership. And I want
What's your question, please?
I wanted to ask Professor Grayling what we can do to try and convince these people that are lifelong liberals that their opinions and beliefs are still valid.
Thank you very much. And this lady here, will you remember that question? Because clearly there's something malfunctioning in my brain today.
I voted Brexit. I'm over 30.
I was looking for under 30s, but go ahead.
I'm just, full transparency about my age. Just to say that I did it for democratic control. Of course, there are many policies that I don't agree with the government on immigration and things like that, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room feel the same. But the point is, it's about democratic control. So my question to you, Professor Grayling and Joe, is what is it about the anti-democratic EU that you're so in love with? The commissioners, the appointees, they're not for the people, and they sneer at elections.
Thank you, we've got the question.
Yeah.
Maybe we answer that one first and then we return to this lady's point.
Well, if you knew something about the institutions of the EU, you would know that it's not undemocratic. I mean, after all, if you take more interest in EU elections for our MEPs, if you know that the Council of Ministers is one of the 3 organisations, that's heads of all the different states who meet and talk about what happens, that we have a European Parliament, which, by the way, is an incredibly civilised institution when you hear the quality of the debates in it sometimes, you would see that it's not quite as undemocratic as you think. But the thing that really strikes me about that point is this. You may remember the white paper. You know, white papers are things that are published long in advance of parliamentary debates with all the facts and the details and the cost-benefit analysis. Well, the white paper that was published for the Article 50 debate on the morning after, 7 minutes past 4 a.m. in the morning after the debate, has in section 2, paragraph 1, the following comment. We have never lost our sovereignty, it said. We've never lost our control. And I quote the next part of that sentence, which says, but it sometimes felt like it, which I think is the most scurrilous thing which has ever been said by any civil servant or politician imaginable, because it's an admission of the fact that that whole thing about take back control and let's recover our democracy and so on was an absolute piece of hot air.
Thank you, Professor Grayling. Thank you. We are incredibly short of time. We've got a minute. But I wonder, Joe, and perhaps you, Toby, if you could respond to the lady there who asked the question about how the liberal voting public can be made to feel that their voice still counts. Is that? I think that was a summation of it.
Yeah.
Toby?
Well, I think one of the attractive things about Theresa May is that she does appeal to a much broader cross-section of the general population than other political leaders do in other parts of the world.
So you're saying they can make their presence felt by voting Conservative?
I do. To invoke the David Goodhart distinction between somewheres and anywheres. In America, the somewheres were represented by Clinton. The somewheres were represented by Trump, the anywheres by Clinton. In France, the somewheres by Le Pen, the anywheres by Macron. Here, I think that Theresa May can represent both, and I think she will embody.
That's like a party political
I think she will embody
Thank
some
you
of the.
very much,
just to give you an example of why I think she will reflect the views of the.
That was already a fabulous example.
Remainers.
Thank you very much, Joe.
It's a good opportunity to say something I've wanted to say all morning, which is thank you to Diane and Toby for coming along and making their voices heard in this audience, which is hostile to them. The way in which progressives, self-styled and actual, and liberals and the left gets heard is by listening to people and hearing their concerns and addressing them and not just preaching to the converted.
Thank you very much.
So well done, Toby and
Diane, last word from the lady.
Okay.
It's got to be 30 seconds.
Okay. I'm going to read you just one sentence. This was an EU report in terms of the Brexit outcome. There is thus a rejection of concepts and ideas such as shared sovereignty, European multi-level governance, supranational democracy, and an ever closer union. If that doesn't tell people whether they remain camp or leave camp, what we rejected on June the 23rd last year, then I'm left wondering what's going on.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much indeed.